Hi, everybody. My name is David Bradshaw. I'm the Assistant Director of the Graduate Center, a unit of the Graduate College that focuses on professional development in all its forms for graduate students and postdoctoral scholars. I'm joined by my colleagues, Nick Sinergy and Dr. Leslie DuPont. They are our facilitators today on the second session of the ABD to PhD writing workshops for fall 22. The subject today is writing in-depth analysis to support your research. Nick is the assistant director for think tanks, specifically writing support. And Dr. DuPont is the College of Nursing writing coach. She also used to, for a time, work for the Writing Skills Improvement Program, which is one of our longtime partners for this workshop series. Our other partner is the Graduate and Professional Student Council. Just so you know, this is being recorded. You are welcome to put questions and comments in the chat. We encourage you to be as interactive as you'd like to be. And with that, I know there is a lot to cover today, both in terms of content and some activities. So I will let Nick and Leslie take over. And thank you so much for being here, Nick. Thanks so much for being here, Leslie. Really looking forward to having you do this workshop again. Appreciate it.
Thanks, David. Yeah. So I just, Nick, jump in whenever. Welcome everyone who's here. And I'm actually going to flip over to the next screen because David did a beautiful job of introducing us. So I was wondering though if we could have a volunteer to read the land acknowledgement statement for the University of Arizona.
I'm happy to do that, Leslie.
I think actually, yeah, sure. Yep, go for it.
Okay. So the U Arizona Land Acknowledgement Statement. We respectfully acknowledge the University of Arizona is on the land and territories of Indigenous peoples. Today, Arizona is home to 22 federally recognized tribes, with Tucson being home to the Ohlone and the Yaqui. Committed to diversity and inclusion, the university strives to build sustainable relationships with sovereign Native nations and Indigenous communities through education offerings, partnerships, and community service.
Thanks so much, David. So basically the goals for today are we're going to do a quick refresher on some basics of analysis, and we're going to identify actually two forms of analysis that we'll be talking about in a sort of intertwined way. So please jump in with questions if one of those threads gets confusing or anything. And then we'll do a little bit of working with analysis to just kind of practice it a bit more and get a stronger feel for it. Nick, was there anything that you wanted to add?
Yeah, I just think that as we go through this, one thing to keep in mind is sort of our perspective that we're trying to bring to bear here. And so both Les and I work with lots of students, have worked lots and lots of students on dissertations and all kinds of graduate writing as well as professional writing. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to take some thoughts about analysis as a kind of, what would you say, movement, maybe in writing that needs to happen, a kind of work that writing can do. And what we're trying to do is distill out a couple of the things that we can maybe draw conclusions from across disciplines. So if you're looking through this and you're thinking, man, I'm in a fix because I need to actually, like, there's one specific question I have about how to tell, find the story in my statistical modeling or something like that, you're probably not going to necessarily find a clean answer to that in this material. However, what this will do is maybe offer you the kind of groundwork or framework to be able to go and ask some of these questions, like formulate some of these questions with your advisor or back with your sort of home department, the folks who are working on, work that's kind of in your discipline. So just to kind of make sure we're managing expectations here, the idea is this is stuff that we can kind of draw some patterns out across a lot of these disciplines. And I think it's really cool for that. We get to see some really nice insights, I think, about what kinds of work this kind of writing can do.
Absolutely. And that's a beautiful segue into our next slide, or our next several slides. This one is sort of just a visual. If any of you are feeling this way, by this way, I'm kind of thinking about this illustration over here on the right. There's data analysis, and this statement about the data analysis chapter of the dissertation is one of the most important parts. There's also analysis in terms of writing and thinking about interpreting and drawing connections among the various data that you're working with, and we'll talk about that more in a minute. Getting back to data, there's this sense of it should be relevant and appropriate to your particular aim. So you want to be thinking about what is my research question, and what are the aims that I'm trying to achieve in answering it. That doesn't mean that right this second you have to have all this in mind. Okay, this is just something to kind of keep on your radar if you're early in the program or if you're working through your master's program. But there is a statement, the overarching aim is to identify significant patterns and trends in the data and display these findings meaningfully. So there's sort of an identification of the data, drawing inferences from the data, and displaying what you've discovered in the data in ways that create almost a story, whether visually or in words. And how do we do this? So everything I just said, if your mind is spinning, that's okay. We're going to talk a little bit about how we do this. And the first question I want to start with is, what is analysis? And here we're really simplifying it, distilling it down to simply saying analysis is telling your readers what something means through exploring its parts and explaining its relevance. And you will find that this initially can be one of the most challenging parts of writing, because again, you're trying to draw connections. Over time, however, it can become one of the most rewarding parts of the writing process. Moving into what is data. So for a lot of you, those of you who are in the hard sciences, for instance, the College of Science, a lot of you will find that data is numeric information. It's quantitative and quantifiable information that you're collecting and analyzing during a research project. And so when you think of data, you're often thinking of numbers, percentages, ranges, patterns that you see, things that are missing, and so forth. However, for those of you who are in the humanities, perhaps education, and the arts, data might be a little different. For example, if you're doing something with literature, you might find that the data is actually, it's the passages that you collect from the various texts that you're exploring and analyzing and writing about. So data can mean different things to different people. And the reason I bring this up is because I don't want anyone to feel like you have to get locked in to one particular perspective of what data is. Nick, did you want to add anything at this point? Are you good? Or
I think that's great. I think another just tangential point about data is, of course, what actually counts as evidence, which we'll come to later in some of our discussions, but just as something to kind of file away as we're talking about this, things that the sort of disciplines will stand on as this is proof or evidence of whatever point will end up being really important, obviously, later in analysis.
Absolutely. Thank you. Excuse me. So this is a list of specific things you can do with your data. You will likely do all of them, but you might not. Several things though. One is summarizing the data. This is the sort of what is it types of questions. So here's where you describe and present details of your results. The results section isn't about interpretation. It's about presentation of the various types of data that you have found. But it can point out the process that you went through in terms of gathering that data. It can also present a certain type of quantitative data analysis, for instance, or different ways of analyzing numbers numerically or statistically. Another thing you can do with data is, again, analysis. And this is where, when we're not just talking about quantitative data analysis, that where we're looking to understand the how and why kinds of questions. This is where we start investigating our data, maybe looking more deeply for patterns and identifying relationships and thinking about why they might be significant or not, both statistically and not statistically. And there's another thing you can do with data is to reflect on it. We say academic reflection, we put academic in parentheses, but really all we're trying to say here is it's a somewhat more formal reflection, where you might find this kind of reflection, for instance, in your discussion sections of articles or a dissertation, a Doctor of Nursing practice project, some other kind of major project, a master's thesis. But it's where you are drawing conclusions and making sense of some of the patterns that analysis of data revealed. It's where you start making claims about these patterns, and why they might be relevant for the purposes of your research, how they might be answering your research questions, how they might be illuminating one or more of your aims or objectives, or how they might be, or hypotheses. That's another way of putting it. Or how they might be presenting unexpected findings, so, that don't agree with hypotheses that, for instance, or objectives that you expected to arrive at. It's also where, in reflection, you're also thinking about other sources of information that might help you make sense of things. Now, this might sound a little weird because we also do this with analysis and synthesis, which is coming up. But for instance, if you're doing a literature synthesis, you are analyzing, you're reviewing the research that's out there, and you are reflecting on it in terms of themes that it may present and so forth, at findings that may be common or might be outliers, and then you aggregate or pull together this information into various patterns and relationships. Synthesis is also when you might identify gaps in the research. So this is kind of broad, kind of chalk drawing of it. But I'm going to leave now to Nick. I'm going to hand over to you and take it away.
Sure thing. Yeah, so one thing that's really good to recall there is if we think about how some of those words are actually formed. Analysis, for example, one thing I like to think of is this kind of classic sense or classical sense of what analysis actually is. And if you kind of look at some of the etymology of it, it's basically to explode something, to kind of break it down into these constituent parts and start to make sense of which parts kind of make this thing tick, you know? And then synthesis is sort of the opposite, where it all kind of, you're starting to fuse things together into this broader kind of idea. And I love the idea of thinking about synthesis as really trying to tap into the relationships between everything. I think that's really key. So, you know, we can talk about this a lot, but one way of starting to do it is to actually think about our work and start to see if we can't identify these specific moments in our work. What we're looking for really is we're trying to get a little more global understanding of how our discipline and these specific genres that we're writing in, for example, a dissertation or a thesis, what's kind of expected in terms of the evidence that we're throwing out there, the data, and also by extension, the kinds of analysis that we're ultimately doing in these particular documents. So one thing that would be really helpful is if we kind of pivoted to the chat here. So if you are able to, if you can get into the chat at the bottom of the screen and answer maybe one of these questions. And I'd love to see these just typed out in the chat or dumped in there. So pick one of these. So the first one is, what evidence are you looking for in the information you gather? So let's say that you're an ed leadership person and you're doing some kind of empirical study or something like that, or studying some population maybe. So a specific sentence that applies to your work to answer the question, what evidence are you looking for in the information you gather? And I know that not everybody's going to understand your project, and that's okay. We're just kind of dropping them in there. Another question you could answer is, how is the evidence addressing your research question? Again, to all of us who don't know your work intimately, it's going to feel out of context, and that's okay. And then the last one is, how might your findings contribute to what is already known in the literature? So whichever one of these feels most appropriate to where you are in your work, please just drop a sentence in answer into the chat, and I'll give you about, let's try 2 minutes. Since I'm in the final stages of my dissertation too, I'll drop mine in there too. So it'd be great to see some folks drop some stuff in there. But in lieu of that, if you aren't able to get to the chat, does anybody want to volunteer to just, since it's a small enough group, to just vocalize this, to verbalize this, to answer one of these questions? What fields are you in, and what's some of the evidence that you're looking for in the information that you're gathering, for example? Oh, thank you. That's cool. That's fascinating. How do you pronounce your name? Is it Kamali, or is it Kamale?
Kamile. Kamile.
Kamile. Okay, thank you. That's wonderful. Cool. So you're doing a historical analysis of Hawaii's criminal justice system's development. Awesome. So what are you using? Are you using like primary texts for that, or are you using?
I don't even know what to call it. And like, I don't know. I'm not really an academic. You know, I actually was an attorney prior to this, or a policy legislative attorney.
Cool.
And so I went back to do my LLM, and now I'm in the SGD program. So I don't really know like exactly where things fall, but it's going to be like laws, policies, court cases, like judicial decisions, language used in public testimony or other kinds of public documents, things like that.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
And a few articles and other people's ruminations about centering indigenous models of justice, like, and those kinds of like theoretical approaches.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's one fascinating part about that. Like I've interacted with maybe 2 or 3 folks who are working in kind of an area that's related to that. And one thing I've noticed a number of times is that for some of those discussions, a part of the analysis is actually done as a way of validating additional or other or alternative sources for those histories. So it's been like you spend some time actually saying, no, guys, we can't just use this legal precedent. We also have to use the voices from these other primary texts and stuff. So it's a fascinating.
Yes, exactly. Sorry, just turn on the light. Yes.
Yeah. So what I love about that is the evidence itself is kind of at stake. It's like you got to like say it's worth it. Trust me. Like there's reason to do this, and then present the evidence. So that's fascinating. What cool work.
Can I jump in for a sec too? Kamila, what I see too is sort of, and with some of the other points, is that sort of taking a deep dive in and saying, and I may be totally off on this, so correct me if I am, but sort of, I'm gonna stay open and be like a sponge initially to see what I find so that I don't inadvertently leave something out too, leave out a voice or leave out a perspective. And, I can see that as being, while it might be kind of stressful at times, also really valuable because you're going in to discover. Does that kind of make sense?
Yes, I actually am approaching with a critical legal, a critical indigenous, critical race framework. So, but part of the framework is addressing first the legal formalist analysis, doing first what attorneys do, where you lay out all the laws and all of the history and all of the authority, and then you talk about everything that underlies that historical context and all the other things, and then you show how impact and intent actually align differently from how we think they do, and you kind of have to weave the secondary analysis after you first present that formalist analysis. So, but
that's super cool. It does, yeah. And one thing that puts in mind for me too is like the sort of dual planes of analysis that are happening. One plane is a sort of methodological plane, and the other is for lack of a better word, a kind of like content or something, like the sort of actual like legal scholarship. But then there's also this methodological thing saying, the method. And I think that's actually true of some of our other folks here too. So when we're thinking about like Catherine's, for example, even in trying to identify or talk about like specific populations and try to understand, what's going on in terms of, in this case, self-efficacy and agency. I mean, this is something that we do in the Writing Center world as well. We try to study efficacy, agency, all that kind of stuff of our tutors and things like that. And of course, as y'all know, those kinds of terms aren't stable. I mean, there's at our level, and by our level, I mean at the graduate level here, those terms are at stake. And so there's a sort of analysis that goes into saying like, well, how are you doing this? What's the methodology for measuring self-efficacy? And is that truly effective or whatever, So I find that really fascinating as well. So keeping in mind that we're like, there's actually multiple foci for our analysis, I think is really key. I'm reading Lynn's here too. So one of my research questions involves relationship building and knowledge information sharing to support. Cool. The evidence I'm using includes documents, policies, questionnaires. Yeah. Yeah, so this is another one where, Lynn, to me, I mean, just as an outsider to this sort of scholarly work here, it seems like, again, the question of what constitutes a valid source here is like part of the question. I think that's wonderful. You cast a nice wide net, and you have to kind of like say, well, yeah, that's a valid thing that speaks to what I'm saying. Is that true?
Yeah, I'm still kind of like framing out, kind of separating it out because some of my papers seem like they're sort of, it kind of all bleeds together.
Mhm.
But I think I'm building off the context of in my first paper is about relationship building and relationality, the ontology, and how indigenous peoples perceive relationships versus Western. So the context of how certain tribes, and I'm focusing in on two tribes I'm working with that are really particularly good at building relationships, establishing policies across multiple levels, working with non-Indigenous partners, and to implement climate policy, to make sure that their voice is heard in different contexts of initiatives so that there's power differential. And then I'm looking more at I'm looking at qualitative data, right, that I have in addition to documents. And then also I'm going to do quantitative analysis of the actual network. You know what I mean? The nodes and who's working with who, what kind of relationships they have. Are they two-way relationships? Are they who is the primary actors? Who's, just to kind of look and then looking at too how information is flowing across those actors and what kinds of knowledges and information. Is it more westernized? Is it indigenous and cultural knowledge, and what kind of knowledges are being used to actually in initiatives and policies and taken into account? Just looking at those types of things in my analysis and seeing what I can deduce from the two case studies that I'm working with.
Yeah, there's a ton of facets to that project. That's really cool. I mean, it sounds like, just revelatory on so many levels. So that's really interesting.
Yeah, so it's going to be like, as I look at the data, I'm going to have to sort of like hone it in. You know what I mean? So it's sort of a process, right? Because I can't. It's too big. So
Yeah.
I'm really trying to like look at my data. Looking at what what I have, and what I think could be more informative, and also I'm partnering with the two tribes, so I also want to make sure that this information is presented in a useful, you know what I mean, at the end is a useful resource that where there's a gap on understanding partnerships, Western and Indigenous, right, and in solving these complex problems. So I want to make sure that as part of that analysis, it really informs that so that we can improve those relationships and those interactions, and it can add to that gap.
Yeah, well, one thing that brings up for me is this kind of question about data collection. So I wonder if we couldn't maybe look at kind of continue the conversation in reference to this question or the idea about data collection itself and this method. Because one thing that you raised for me there, and do you mind if we go to the next one? One thing that you raised for me there is like this idea about audiences.
Could I ask? I'd like to hear just a little bit about. There's only one more, and is it Tala or Tela? And it's taking it's looking at an animal model for investigating cerebrovascular aging, and using this model to illustrate a mechanism of action responsible for increased vulnerability to traumatic brain injury in the geriatric population. And it sounds too like to looking for potential, I see potential therapeutic target, and I would love to hear a little bit more about what that means. Oh, we've got another one too. So maybe I jumped the gun. Chingy, yeah.
Yeah, awesome. Is it Tala? Is that right?
Yes, it's Tala.
Cool.
Yeah, and yes, that's exactly right. I'm using a new animal model, and so because there's a lot of parts to my data. First, I have to show that this model is valid, and then and that obviously takes a lot of different data collection and analysis with that, and then after that, supporting how this model, now valid, can be used to evaluate cerebrovascular aging and in different contexts, but in my for my project alone for traumatic brain injury. And then with that, now narrowing into a specific pathway involved in traumatic brain injury that we can actually target and treat and hopefully improve the quality of life for the most vulnerable population that experiences traumatic brain injuries.
That's fascinating. When you say an animal model, what does that concept? Is that like a theoretical model? Is that an actual like? Yeah,
it's an actual mouse. Yes. I unfortunately, so to do many of these types of studies, you have to have an animal model to really look at the different things that happen in live animals that you just can't control for in a petri dish, essentially. And oftentimes the best way to do that is in a mouse. They're so very, very similar to humans that they make a great model. And so, yes, I'm using mice for this.
Cool. That sounds like fascinating research for sure. So I love the point that you made too about validating that as a model as well. I mean, that does seem to be a common thread, but everybody uses, of course, different methods for validation. Like whether if you're in psychology, you're using, potentially like statistical or other kinds of precedents to be able to validate, clinical situations and things like that. And then in this instance, we've got a sort of different measure for what is valid and what is not. So I think that's really interesting and definitely a part of our sort of consideration as we're building out these thoughts about analysis. And then is it Jinji? Is that right? Or can you pronounce your name?
It's Jamie.
Jingy. Okay. Hey, it's great to meet you. So your project sounds fascinating as well. So you're working on aesthetic theories.
Sort of. Intellectual history, more like.
Cool. So what are you digging into texts? Or are you digging into what kinds of artifacts and things?
So technically I work on the early modern period of the 19th century, but since my fieldwork has been postponed, I've been looking into 20th century aesthetics theories that have strong ties with Heidegger's philosophy and beautiful cultural nationalism. So hopefully, by arguing that the 1920s, 30s aesthetics theories lack consideration for popular culture, I could say that our current or some of the previous scholarships focus too much on the elitist part of the whole literati situation. But one of the problems I've recently encountered is that because it's a bit out of my league, it's highly theoretical and philosophical, and they have been discussed in other areas. So I don't quite know when analyzing these information, how far should I go? How much should I explain in order for them to serve the purpose of my argument?
I think too, is it okay if I jump in for a second? I think too, that's a common challenge with anything related to philosophy, Jingy, isn't it? That there's sort of this built-in expectation that you're going to really almost, really take a very, I don't know if deductive is the right word, but approach of kind of arguing the point in every single way you can think of to present the perspective you're trying to present. So I may be off on that, but I can see that challenge that you mentioned, kind of just being part of the philosophical materials that you're dealing with and looking through, and sort of just that philosophical perspective of analyzing something or arguing something from every dimension. Is that close to what?
Yeah, sounds about right.
Yeah, I would add one other thing too, as somebody who's I'm highly sympathetic to this particular cross-disciplinary question. And in some ways, it is not at all cross-disciplinary, because the folks who are thinking about aesthetics and the folks who are thinking about philosophy, or claiming to do philosophy and claiming to do aesthetics, they're talking sort of adjacent to each other. But the difficulty is, of course, trying to figure out what your discipline demands for you to do to be able to get your PhD and get published, or do whatever your goals are to accomplish those particular goals. In other words, I think you mentioned Heidegger, is that right? Yeah, so in other words, like, do you need to be, steeped in the Heideggerian circles or whatever, in order to make the aesthetic points that you need for your committee and your discipline? Or is it that that's what you're trying to do? You want to be steeped in this, and that you want to be a Heideggerian, or at least be thinking in that kind of. So yeah, I definitely sympathize with that, because in my work too, literature and philosophy, it's easy to just kind of find yourself down a rabbit hole, really in either direction. So that's fascinating and difficult. And I think one of the things that I would keep in mind is that when you start moving down into a field like that, just keeping a good reference on where your committee, your mentors, the other people in your field are. And if you find yourself moving too narrowly down one particular kind of rabbit hole, just pop up for a second and say, let me just take my bearings really quickly, because can I rely on somebody else's deep read analysis of Heidegger, for example, to be able to make the salient point that I have, which is the fusion of my perspectives on these 5 other things and Heidegger, not just my reading on Heidegger. And I try to keep this like in my head all the time. It's really tough, because it's easy to just want to pivot down there, especially on something like any one of these aesthetic theories they tend to be so like monolithic in ways. People who worked on these same ideas for a very long time, it's hard to kind of chip your way in. So I sympathize.
I think to piggyback on that too that's when Jiggy and actually all of you to one degree or another, bringing yourself back to what, and if you're being guided by even a rough research question at this point, what is it? It's kind of like even when you're writing that freshman composition, wait a minute, what is my thesis statement? Coming back to that. That's one thing, to keep it kind of pulling yourself back to center. Another one is reminding yourself that it's only part of this journey. Your dissertation, your thesis, it's only part of this amazing scholarly journey that you're on. And then a third thing is maybe keeping a chart of insights that pop up, patterns, themes, maybe, having even like 3 columns. One is kind of called insights or whatever, themes, whatever you want. The second one could be sources, what are the, just quick name and date sources so that you can keep track of where those themes popped up. And then a notes column where you can reflect on possible uses for what you're discovering. And then you can come back and review it every now and then and kind of use it as, oh, okay, wait a minute, this is really interesting, but it's pulling me off. Maybe I can come back to that in the future. But these 3 things work together well. And so I can maybe start thinking and reflecting a little bit more on why that is.
Great advice. Thank you so much.
So thinking through this question of, our methodology here is really fascinating. And I think let's start with where we ended up there, as far as, this very kind of specific approach to doing this kind of work that's in aesthetics and humanities and philosophy. And thinking through, like, well, there are certainly more or less formal methods for being able to carry that kind of work out. In fact, if you are steeped enough in philosophy, for example, you could find several traditions, even within philosophy, that provided different methods. So Heidegger, for example, you can do from a phenomenological method. You say, basically, I'm trying to do phenomenology, which has its own sort of, this is what counts as evidence. This is the process by which we arrive at conclusions. And the way that we analyze things is this phenomenological way, and that's a very particular way, has a whole literature behind it. But of course, in these other disciplines like education or others that are sort of clustered around social sciences, or sort of by reference to social sciences, there are some potentially more, what would you say? I wouldn't say easily identifiable, because often these things are somewhat difficult to identify, but like there are some categories. And when you move your way through the social science training, you get trained in some categories, right? So we've got, the quantitative category, for example, and the qualitative category. And then of course, a lot of folks, it sounds like, was it Lynn, that you've got a pretty mixed set of methods there as far as qualitative, quantitative, a lot of different pieces. And so in that instance, I think it's definitely an instance in which we're compensating for gaps that would manifest in if we just chose the quantitative method or the qualitative method. But one thing I will point out, again, pivoting to kind of Lynn's discussion there, was that there is, in this qualitative approach, there is some fluidity in terms of, even like, that's okay to be able to actually change the approach as you're moving to respond to new contexts and insights that you're seeing. So like Les was mentioning, like keeping track of some of those insights actually informs your process. So a lot of qualitative and quantitative, frankly, researchers that I know keep like logs of where they are. And that way they note those instances where they've had, they've made a change to their actual method of data collection based off of something that was a finding. So it's got this nice recursivity to it. You continue to re-ask those questions and ask yourself if you're actually, getting the information you were seeking. Some of the quantitative methods, attempt to kind of do this in a slightly more fixed way, and that is as a way of hoping, ideally, to kind of position themselves in a more or less objective kind of position. And I think, the humanities likes to take some pot shots sometimes at some of these, at the actual level of objectivity that's ever achieved here. That said, to be able to stably present a set of circumstances and parameters and then interrogate those is a really powerful thing. It also lets you really cast a really wide net and see insights that the narrower nets of qualitative research and things like case studies and stuff won't let you see. So you can see population level data, you can mine for statistical significances and relationships that aren't visible from the sort of embedded position of some of these other methods. So this is very likely, review for everybody here, but I just want to make sure that we're talking across the disciplines cleanly, and that we're familiar with the fact that, like, again, we might be doing philosophy, but that doesn't mean we're sitting under a tree picking our nose, like just coming up with stuff. What we're trying to do is there are methodologies there, and they're very strict actually in philosophy. There is very much like an argument over what actually counts and what doesn't. Similarly, in the natural sciences and other places, we might have a quantitative study that has very fixed parameters there. So catching a sense for this is really helpful, because it definitely helps inform us on, what constitutes, or what our analysis really kind of needs to do, the kinds of work that it really needs to do. So I think two of the main movements that a lot of these analyses, I should say that a lot of these data collection kinds of methods yield here, things that we need to do to respond to the data that we're collecting, are summary and analysis. And we're making a subtle differentiation here, but it's an important one. So summary can actually be extremely complex. You're literally making decisions about what the essence of something is. You're intentionally leaving stuff out of your description, or you're intentionally picking a path. You're saying this thing that happened, this is what it means, or this is what it says, right? And you're literally picking a path as a way of trying to summarize what's going on. So summarizing the data is one way of certainly like showing what's going on in the data, right? But the real power of analysis actually resides in something that's not exactly trying to do a one-to-one reflection here, but literally something that is not necessarily at the first level just obvious, not just mere reporting, but breaking apart what you've reported now and starting to make sense of that mess. So disassembling it, or to just keep on switching metaphors, to pull the back off the clock and take a look at the gears and then take them apart and separate them into gears with triangular teeth and gears with square teeth. And, so we're like starting to do this categorization as a way of really grasping, kind of wrapping our heads around these constituent parts. And again, we just by extension, we can think about this in all kinds of facets. We can think about it in a philosophical way by saying, well, we're going to break apart these concepts because we think they're related for some reason. They're related. They talk about these same phenomenon or something like that. They all have to do with being rather than knowing or something, some kind of distinction like that. Or we can say this is empirical data that we need to separate in certain ways that are significant because of the questions we're asking. So I think another way of doing this is to ask ourselves some questions. So I think Les was going to walk us through some of these.
Yeah, just to kind of continue that. Thanks so much, all of you. Great discussion. So again, you don't have to try to answer all of these, but look at each of these questions and try to answer one. And think back, and I thinking about the sort of what the data implies. Or am I inferring something from it? How am I looking right now in this moment? How am I thinking about, say, the data or evidence I'm looking at or considering looking at, or wrestling with, or whatever? Or is there one particular area that stands out to me? So one is, what do I see in the data? What story does the data seem to be revealing? Another, what patterns or constituent parts have I identified in the data? How can I think about or categorize the data? How does the data correspond to my research question? How does the data correspond to the research in my field? And if the data doesn't correspond, what do I do with it? So take a couple minutes to kind of reflectively wrestle with free write on one of those questions and then post it to the chat. Good. I think you're starting to come up with some posts. And if you aren't comfortable posting in the chat, would anyone like to unmute and just talk for a minute on even how these questions struck you? Did you have an insight as you were thinking about any of the questions? Did another question emerge? Or as you were writing, did you discover something new, new perspective? I'd like to share. So Nick, I noticed when you were writing about, you were writing your response, which also looks fascinating, that the statement that stood out to me in particular was each mode highlights new facets of the original phenomenon. And so my translation of that, which may not be your translation of that, but is as I look at different frameworks or different perspectives on something, I see the original thing that I'm exploring or examining in a slightly new way. I learned something new from taking a different, almost like looking at it from a different camera angle, and new shadows or lines or planes of light are come into focus.
Exactly. Yeah, that's definitely what I was thinking. That different chapters sort of take on, they use different thinkers, so theoretical perspectives, basically. So I'm digging into slightly different traditions. And when you go back and look at the same kind of phenomenon through those new lenses, then that person's way of thinking about the world and their kind of schema, their schemata that they use to make sense of that, all of a sudden shows you things about that original phenomenon that weren't necessarily relevant. So, or not relevant, weren't necessarily visible in the first, or relevant. Hopefully they're relevant. Who knows?
But yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I think too, Nick, as you were talking, I was kind of looking at Jinyi's statement here too, and thinking how much that could apply there too. That Jinyi, in some ways, you might be. And again, this is my perspective, but it's almost like you're trying to explode out even the underlying assumptions that caused the early 20th century sort of elitists to look backwards for inspiration and justification instead of looking around them at the moment or looking forwards, as if they were kind of transfixed by one or two old or traditional models, but not able to look, kind of break outside, explode outside that framework.
Yeah, I love that too, because it's sort of like, how many times has that happened where somebody has looked to another cultural milieu to try to basically cherry pick things that they like, they like things that they were sort of already interested in. Yeah, it's fascinating.
Well, and that can be a pressure we feel, especially when we're sort of novice investigators, right? Mm-hmm. That we think we're supposed to cherry pick, not realizing that's how we're looking at it, that our evidence is supposed to justify our claims, rather than, no, our evidence is actually supposed to illuminate, and we have to find out what is illuminated. Hala, you make a point here in relation to that. Often data can have unexpected results, but is still data. And it's investigating that unexpected data can indeed lead to some unexpected and very important insights, and maybe even new models too. And I love that you said it happened a lot on your master's project too, that you weren't getting what you expected, which caused you to then have a whole new set of questions to investigate, which is great. And I think, Jamie, you were going to say something too. Feel free to jump in. Or did you add it to the chat? You might have added it to the chat.
I don't actually.
Okay. And then Lynn, some initial, oh, Tala, were you going to say something? I'm sorry.
You're fine. Yeah, I totally agree, especially about the illuminations. What is the data telling us? A lot of the world's biggest discoveries were accidents. So
absolutely,
data is data.
The spilled wine on the piece of paper. Exactly. Yeah, and I love actually the challenges you're all describing. You know, Lynn, some initial data shows that information and partnerships may be centralized. However, I need to look at more and different types of data. And again, qualitative and quantitative, they kind of inform each other in some ways, or help you take different looks at this data. And I agree, considering the framework for analysis is so important, because we do need a framework for analysis, but not to shut down our ability to look at, especially that surprising data, the outliers were unexpected, but to give us a structure for planning out at least our initial methods and ways of possibly looking at looking for patterns. And then Kamila, I struggle to think about legal research sources as data. I'm constantly trying to square the information I'm getting in interdisciplinary spaces with the kinds of sources we use. That's really interesting, because, and it makes me think, I think you said you were a lawyer. Could part of that struggle come from how you actually used legal research sources in your capacity as a lawyer? Like you're having to almost restructure the way you look at this material, or is that not really?
Yeah, maybe. I guess I don't really know like how to classify whenever I'm in like graduate spaces that are interdisciplinary. I'm understanding that in other disciplines, like dissertation work looks pretty different from in our discipline, and there's a lot of empirical basis, and kind of like the lit review is like really, I don't know, maybe like that's really what I identify with as like our whole realm of research is kind of like just lit review, I guess. So I don't know, like I don't really know like what to call that, but there, you know, I'm also in the dissertation course right now, and she's talking to us about thinking about whether and how we need or could use empirical evidence, and if we do, like what skills do we need, because we're all lawyers and like we don't know what we're talking about in these kinds of things. So so yeah, it's when I come in here, I'm always, so when I'm reading the questions, I'm like, wow, that's really confusing to me. Like I guess I don't really think about it, but I do know that yes, you're right in a way that like when you're an attorney, you're constantly trying to use the direct authority and to demonstrate the winning argument or whatever, to support the argument with the authority, and by analogy with other cases. But in this case, there's a little bit of, maybe there would be an empirical kind of thing if I end up kind of aggregating information that I'm finding, which I probably won't. But it is definitely a different way of looking at the history and the research. And especially because like we were talking about in the earlier thing, where I'm trying to validate, like what Nick was saying, I'm trying to validate other forms of data that are not currently represented, like Native Hawaiian historical ideas and concepts, which, you know, don't really inform like the Western legal formalist analysis at all, but should. So yeah, there's definitely like, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know how to think about that, or like how to classify it in these more traditional terms.
It almost, yeah, and Lynn, actually, it's funny that you wrote great point, Kamila. My research is interdisciplinary and I find it challenging. And then Jamie, you're saying something similar too. I'd love to be a fly on the wall if three of you had a discussion about that and how you're navigating that, that sort of issue of interdisciplinarity.
Could I offer
I'm going,
one quick
oh,
comment?
absolutely. Do you want me to move it back?
It doesn't matter. It's fine. I sympathize with that. So I did some graduate work in journalism, which is kind of silly because it's journalism. You don't need graduate work for that. What I loved about it was it's where I learned how to write better, I think, because the program that I was in was really interesting. It was like an embedded program. We were actually in a newsroom going to classes like in a conference room, and the professors kind of drove to that newsroom. So we lived and kind of worked in the newsroom like almost like a teaching hospital. It's a lot of fun. The thing that, I mean, I kind of felt similarly in that the currency of journalism was different from the currency of the scholarly pursuit, this academic scholarly pursuit. And there was an attempt to try to like reconcile those from time to time. The things that we worked on for like classes and stuff we could occasionally like make them so that way they would work for a journalistic venue. Like, in other words, we would write an article, cut it down, and then shape it into like this other genre for a news feature or something. But yeah, it's an interesting idea. And one thing that I've sort of like grappled with over the years is scholars have this thing often, these like lofty, elite kind of scholars. And they talk about it in terms of like maybe like some kind of line of inquiry or some kind of like project. And the project is not just a dissertation. It's like they're sort of interested in an idea or cluster of ideas, and that takes them through kind of a career trajectory. And it's basically like, I'm going to follow this out and see where it goes. And then like it might vary a little bit, but I've got this core set of questions that are going to structure my kind of scholarly inquiry. That resonated with me because, you know, I couldn't articulate those questions as an incoming PhD student or master's student or anything, but like you get some tools at some point and enough, you're conversant enough in the literature that's out there to be able to say, well, there's like a landscape of people who are kind of also interested in these clusters, and I can kind of position myself in this landscape. It takes a while to get there though, because you have to be, again, it's kind of like you just become conversant in the conversation that's happening. But one thing that I will, again, just sort of mention that I noticed with the journalistic thing is in my master's program, we were interested in becoming better at being journalists and managers of journalistic enterprises. In PhD work, we were interested in thinking about whether or not that enterprise should be done that way at all, or whether what the blind spots of that enterprise is as a whole thing, as a field, whether the scholarly research on that field was even justified in making claims about what it was making claims on. So there's this sort of like, does the journalistic scholarly stuff, because there are people out there doing studies on journalism and journalism education, and is that very niche group of people doing what they should be doing to whatever XYZ, all this kind of stuff. In other words, it was like yet another orbit. And that was like a little bit of there was like a little vertigo where I was like, whoa, okay, I got to figure out who we're talking to and what we're talking about. One thing though that I think is a good grounding technique is to think about the audience for any of these individual pieces. And that came to mind with Lynn's work particularly, because what is going to be the right or appropriate or valid analysis for the tribal communities is going to be way different than the stuff that you would get sort of like scholarly currency for in another area on campus or something like that. And keeping that and understanding that actually both of those projects still contribute to your overall scholarly project and inquiry, but they're doing this in very varied, there we go, ways that may not actually immediately talk to each other. Because it's like, well, no, I just did this like one-off article for this group of people. And then on the other hand, I did this like more comprehensive, like almost psychological study that I had to get IRB approval for. And those two things aren't talking to each other yet. But at some point in the overall scholarly trajectory, they might. I don't know, those are some thoughts. Does this make sense at all?
Yes. Thank you.
It does make sense. And we can circle around too, keep circling around to these points as you need to. I'm going to make the next couple of slides sort of our sacrificial slides so we can move forward. So all that means is I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them unless any of you would like me to explore them a little more. The reason that I throw pi up there, and if any of you were undergraduates, first year or second year, first year undergraduates at the University of Arizona, you might recognize the discussion of the pi, P-I-E, body paragraph structure. Basically, this is just a reminder that if you find yourself stuck, sometimes we can kind of introduce a topic in a paragraph. We even know what we want to pull in to illustrate that point or that topic with. But then we sometimes can jump over this, the E part. And this is where we are making sense of those examples, the illustrations, the evidence data we pulled in. So what conclusions, this is where you can come back to that idea, what conclusions am I drawing from this example that or illustration that I just used? Or what significance or relevance does it have in relation not only to the point I'm making here in the paragraph, but then back to this broader connection to my overall research question. So just kind of reminding yourself of the pie structure can help you remember to address all three of those elements to one degree or another in most of your body paragraphs. And here too, I'm not going to take a long time, but I just wanted to draw your attention. There are many places where analysis can go in a thesis or dissertation. Ironically, one section that I left out is the results section. But when, especially in the STEM and social sciences field, you'll talk specifically about methodologies and instruments you use to analyze quantitative and some qualitative data, although analyzing it quantitatively in the results section. So in terms of discussing data analysis, that's often where that section is often where it will happen in STEM and social sciences. In general, across disciplines, there will be some sort of introduction and maybe a separate literature review and synthesis chapter or section, article, whatever, or maybe that would be embedded in the introduction. While the analysis you're doing here has more to do with pattern recognition of, of what's out there in the research, it's still you drawing connections, saying here are the themes or major findings or even outliers I'm noticing in the research, and here are some possible, there's some possible relevance drawn from those findings and themes. Humanities, liberal arts, fine arts, we tend to analyze throughout. If we're looking at a dissertation or master's thesis or project and capstone project in another doctoral program, we often are analyzing text themes, musical patterns, and visual patterns, political or sociocultural reflections within visual or musical or textual patterns. So that tends to be a thread we read throughout our documents. So that was kind of what I wanted to say there. And again, jump in if you want me to pause or want to add.
Could I make one quick little side note?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
One really easy way of thinking about this, if you've never read a humanities or liberal arts or whatever, and of course we're like making these huge generalizations, and of course everything's they're all going to be different and everything, but in general, if you think about like humanities, liberal arts stuff, a lot of times it'll be like, here's the status of the scholarship and my question, and then there's like a lot of time and space spent on making your like my observations, my own analysis. I'm going to be like showing you different things, different aspects of this text or whatever that I'm finding, but I'm going to spend a bunch of time really kind of like deep diving with maybe relatively few citations during that particular part of the movement, basically. So the beginning, there'll be a bunch of citations where I'm saying, look at the field, it's studied a bunch of this stuff. And then there'll be like a pretty nice chunk there where I'm just kind of going to town, making some observations, and you as the reader are going to be the arbiter about whether or not I'm convincing or not based on my textual evidence that I'm offering up. In some of these other fields, actually what is happening is after there's a sort of basic expression of or reporting of what's being found or what has been found, then a lot of times there's an attempt to reintegrate that back into the scholarship that's out there. So that you'll find that in some of those sections of analysis, it's not just here's what I found in the and what it looks like to me, but a lot of times it's I noticed these 3 nodes, and look, that's interesting because there's some other scholars who have maybe noticed a node, one of the 2 nodes or something. So there's this like citation set there that says I'm attempting to kind of add this out there to this overall collection of knowledge that's aggregating. So it's one thing to just keep in mind the function of this particular kind of intellectual movement.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you, Nick. And then again, analysis is used in many ways, and I think we've kind of covered a lot of this already. So this is just kind of a nice reminder. But I'm going to move us on for a moment. I wanted to, first of all, ask if anyone needs a quick bio break or coffee break. Would you like to take 5 minutes and just kind of get up, stretch? Does anyone need that? Or are you good to keep going? We want to make sure, let's see that. Okay. I'm not hearing anything. It sounds like we're okay to go on. So let's do this. As we go on, if you need to, okay, great. If you need to, then just get up, scoot to the bathroom, the kitchen, wherever, and then just come back and join us. So, so Nick, we're going to jump in with you to the revisit.
Sounds good. So let's take just a second and just see if maybe we can't verbalize this or drop it at the chat here too. But are there things that we're sort of thinking of in relation to this sort of movement of this analysis movement here that are kind of changing about the way that we see our own data, and maybe like some of the stories that we might be finding of significance, or do you still have kind of a lot of questions about how exactly we need to be thinking about analysis as it pertains to our own specific work? I feel like we're still in pretty general territory. So I'm looking for connections to your specific work here.
So in other words, Nick, are you kind of asking in sort of these issues we've talked about in sort of, more general abstract, are you asking people if they would share connections they're starting to see maybe, or ways of looking at the data that they're starting to think about, or just something that came to mind as we were talking?
Absolutely, yeah. Does anybody have any insights that they've come to so far to share? Okay, well we'll keep on digging here. Let's see if we can get, when we wanted to pivot at some point here shortly to actually looking at some specific examples of it. And I'm hoping that through the use of that, the kind of examples and actually being able to talk about some of those specifics, that maybe we'll be able to start to tease out some additional kinds of insights that might be really relevant to you. Before we did that though, I think it would be worthwhile popping over here. And I think Leslie, you were going to take us through this video.
Yeah, I think this will also give us, it'll give you a break from the two of us for a few minutes, and another, a really articulate discussion of one way you might want to approach analyzing the data and writing an analysis chapter. It is a few minutes long. Let me make sure I'm sharing the sound. And I'm going to try playing it from right within the presentation, but if we run into a problem, I'll go ahead and jump to YouTube.
Welcome to This Week. And this week what we're talking about is your analysis chapter, because at this stage you've collected all your data and now you need to think about it, and you've presented them in their findings chapter. Now you have to think about, well, what am I going to put in my analysis chapter? So I'm speaking to Dr. Bernadette Quinn today, so thanks for joining us, Bernadette. So let's start with, what's the difference between the findings and the analysis chapter, because sometimes people find that difficult.
Okay, yeah, well, I mean, it is a hard one. I mean, the way I look at it is the findings chapter is it's very descriptive. So it's what you found, you know, how many, who are they, where are they. So it's very, very descriptive. And all you've really put into your findings chapter are your findings. You know, you haven't really commented on it yourself, and neither have you gone back to your literature chapter. And now this is where the analysis differs from the findings. Sorry, once you move into your analysis chapter, now your job is to interpret those findings. Now you must be really careful not to be repeating your findings.
And that's the problem, isn't it? Often is that what you read in the analysis is the same as the findings.
Now you must really try not to do that. And I suppose the key thing is what you're trying to do here now is to pull out what is important among those findings. So in your findings chapter, you've got a great mass of data, whatever type it is, but not all of it is equally important. So the first thing you got to do is you got to sift through those findings and figure out, well, which is important and which is not.
And what's the way of doing that? Yeah, exactly.
I mean, there's a skill there. So, well, it'll come from your understanding of the matter that you're studying. So if you've really, you know, gone into your lit, gone out and found something, you now are an expert on it, you're very knowledgeable on it, and you just have to trust yourself, trust your instinct. I mean, what is important? I mean, in your findings, I suppose, have people been saying similar things over and over again? Is something coming up all the time? Is something looking problematic, or is something really, you know, grasping your attention?
And it also comes down to themes, doesn't it? That we have to sort of start thinking now about exactly like what are the key issues, and also start thinking back to what you written in your lit chapter. Because to a certain extent, the findings chapter actually doesn't really bear much relation to what you did in your lit chapter.
So your findings is just this massive description, and to be honest, it can be very boring for a reader, and that is what you have to watch out for as well. In your analysis then, as you say, you're going to pull out what's important, you're going to add in your interpretation of that, and then secondly, you're going to now link it back into the lit. So what has the lit been saying, and where does your findings connect with the lit?
Absolutely.
And wherever you can find connections.
I'm going to unmute for a minute. I just want to clarify that here, what they're referring to as findings, we would probably refer to as results. And what she's talking about with analysis, we would probably refer to as the discussion or conclusion section, if you're feeling a little confused.
That's what you're going to write about, because that's what matters.
And it's also important, isn't it? The difference is that the findings isn't going to have any references in it, because we're not referring back to anything, whereas the analysis is back to the thing about trying to tie back in what you've identified in the literature to see, are you finding the same thing or different things?
So in your findings chapter, there's nothing there but findings, nothing else. Whereas in the analysis chapter, there's your commentary on the findings, which is new, because you haven't done that in the findings chapter. Plus there is the reintegration of the literature. So you'll be saying things like, as Smith 2005 wrote about in his study of tourism destinations, in Dublin we see that similar kinds of things are occurring, or dissimilar things are occurring. It doesn't really matter whether it's matching or not matching. Sorry, but what matters is that you can connect your findings
back into it. Okay. And the other thing that's very important as well, isn't it, that some students miss is to bring back in the research questions, that they forget what were the research questions that I wrote in my methodology chapter. And I've seen some students quite successfully use the research questions as their headings, if you like, and then work underneath them. And that means that it's much more structured perhaps, and it provides a focus for the chapter. That can work quite well.
If you were to ask me what makes a good analysis chapter, I mean, I think that's a key thing, the structuring. Like, think of the reader. The reader has read through the findings, and possibly there's been a little bit of information overload there. And now they really need you to show them what's important, and you do this by theming your analysis, I would say. So you pull out the big themes, and then you use those as your section heads. And very often, as you say, there'll be words in there that have come from your research question, or have come from your objectives.
And it's very important, isn't it, that the analysis chapter is what makes or breaks a dissertation or a thesis. I mean, that differentiates the really good students from the not so good students. And so it's very important that students don't leave it till the end and just sort of write off, 5-10 pages of more or less repetition. That's one of the most important chapters maybe after the lit review that they pay attention to.
I mean, we're looking to see, is your work going to contribute is it going to contribute? It doesn't matter how large or how small, but it should add some new piece of knowledge. And this is where you're going to make it in the analysis.
And the, sort of the so what question. So what is the purpose of the dissertation? What have you found that actually why did you bother doing it?
Well, this is why I've done it, because it shows me that X, Y, and Z has come through. But I think one of the key problems that people find is, what goes into the findings, what goes into the analysis. And that does take an awful lot of work, but if you try and kind of stick to the couple of basic rules, like the findings are just the pure description of what you found, and then don't repeat that then once you go into the analysis. Don't repeat. You really mustn't do that, because you'll bore the reader silly. And that is hugely important.
And I mean, there's a reason why in our marking structure we have different markings. That the analysis is what we're marking, not just the findings when it gets to that point.
And it takes a real skill to pull out what is important, and the reader's looking for that.
And it also takes time. The students need to give themselves time to work out what that analysis is.
And you can only really do that well if you've engaged with your research and you've really become comfortable with what you're doing, and then it's all going to come to the fore in your analysis chapter. It'll benefit
you. Great, thanks very much. So hopefully that will give you some helpful tips in terms of thinking about the differences between your findings and analysis.
Okay, so I think here, and I would love to hear, oops, I'm gonna go back. Oopsie. I would love to hear some takeaways on that, but I'll start us off by saying that, again, where they say findings, I think they're really talking about results, where you don't interpret, you're just describing, summarizing, reporting on the data. And then analysis, they were talking about the discussion where you are making connections. But one of the really interesting points I heard was it doesn't really matter what is or isn't matching up with your research question or study hypotheses or aims or whatever, but instead what matters is the connections that you're making with it or drawing with it. And and again, that kind of takes us back to we sometimes might be making connections to new and unexpected insights, discoveries. Let me just check the chat too. So I'm seeing some great notes. Nick, do you want to speak to any of your notes that you popped into chat?
These were just things that caught my ear listening through. I really like these as sort of, as our conversation has really kind of highlighted, when we're talking about a kind of notional academic scholarly article genre, where we've got these specific movements that happen, and there actually might be named sections. So there's an introduction, potentially there's a methods. So this is what some people refer to as an IMRAD kind of format, which again has like these very distinct sections in it, where you have results and then discussion as specific. When we're talking about that version of analysis, I love some of these things here. The analysis links findings back into the lit. But I also think that, and brings back in these research questions and shows the reader what's important. But I also think that you could take these and apply them to an email that was being sent to an administrator as a way of proposing that we take action on something. In other words, basically, if you're saying I've done some analysis, or I'm going to engage in some kind of analysis, even if it's in a much more informal kind of genre or a different genre from the IMRAD genre, I still think some of these hold true. For example, like your analysis of a particular situation, should probably, in the scholarly context at least, link your own sort of schema for how this is like set up, how this situation is unfolding, whatever, should link that into some broader conversation or literature. I think analysis is really, functioning well when it does that. For my work all the time, I'm making arguments about how important it is for the university and university students to have peer-to-peer support for writing, right? So I'm constantly saying, well, there's actually a bunch of research and it's been going on for decades. And so what I'm constantly doing is saying, look at the way we're structuring things, it's in line with this research, and that's why we know it's effective, And the same thing with, some of these other things, the prioritization is, I think, a really key function of analysis. The way that you decide to describe or break apart these pieces can help your reader really navigate them and understand what's important. So I like those as just kind of guides to multiple genres, but specifically in the scholarly context.
Absolutely. And by the way, you can save the chat if you want to. You can download it to your computer, and where you'll find it once you do that is most likely not in the downloads folder. It will probably be in your computer's discussion documents folder, and then you'll see a Zoom folder, and you'll find the chat. So we've got, we just want some discussion prompts that we wanted to have you look at. We've got two passages coming up. We want to identify the claim that you see. We want to have you think about what data is used to support that claim. Nick, would you mind typing this as I'm talking and then popping it into the chat? Then that way people can refer to it as we go. So identify the claim being made in the passage, then what data is being used to support that claim. Then see if you can find any phrasing in the passage that refers to the data's significance or relevance. And finally, does the paragraph work? Does the paragraph, is it effective in presenting, supporting, and kind of unpacking, reflecting on a claim? And what are the strengths with which that paragraph does it? What are its weaknesses? That's a lot. We're not expecting you to, necessarily take both passages through all of these points. But if you want to try, I think it's a great activity. We're going to look at two. One is a very, it's a, not astronomy. Well, I guess it is astronomy. I was also thinking of optics. But this, so it's sort of that sort of traditional hard science approach, this passage. So the first question we come to with this is, again, what is the claim that is being made here? Can anyone, do you want to take a shot at identifying the main point being made? And you don't have to be right. It's just a matter of let's, trying something out. What do you think is the main point? You want to take a shot at it. What claim do you think is being made? Let me ask it this way. If you look at the statement, after performing the MCMC sampling using the model and methods described above, we obtained samples from the posterior distribution over the parameters beta something. Sorry, I'm not that versed in mathematics and statistical language of the model. So does that sound like a claim or a summary, a description? Exactly. It sounds like a description. Thanks, Jean. It's not a claim. It's not something that is, really supportable by evidence and analysis of that evidence. It's part of the description of the evidence. So we've got this long description, and regardless of whether it's an area that you're strong in, think about the language being used. After performing the sampling, we obtained samples from this blah, blah, blah. We have done this for models including all parameters simultaneously, and also for models including one parameter of interest, along with the intercept, again, beta something, and mask parameters, beta mask, at a time. Our results for the mean and 95% confidence intervals of the full set of parameters for each of the observed gallery properties are shown in figure 2. All of that so far is illustration, description, summary of what they're doing with the data that they're obtaining, the quantitative. If they're, in a sense, describing how they've looked at the data, how they've quantitatively started analyzing it. These are taken from the posterior distributions for simulations involving one observable at a time, using all model parameters simultaneously. The means and intervals are calculated for each parameter, blah, 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 blah. The 4 points, we find that the constraints from the all parameter fits are consistent with fits where we sampled from a posterior over just one of the parameters of interest. So, any claim in there? Not being an expert, I would say that the closest thing so far I'm finding to a claim is this last sentence of the first passage. If we're just looking at the first passage, it's saying here's a pattern that we noticed. Okay. Here now we get into something that shifts from summary. So we've got this possible claim here. We find that the constraints from the all parameter fits are consistent with fits where we sampled from a posterior over just one of the parameters of interest. It is evident from these samples that the simulations suggest some non-trivial dependence and blah, 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 blah. In particular, the galaxy effective radius appears to be correlated with the galaxy surface density is also correlated with. These correlations warrant some further investigation and are discussed in the following subsections. So if you look at the other questions, exactly, I think all of you are catching that. It's not really until we get to that second paragraph that we start seeing anything that moves beyond summary. Does any phrasing refer to the data's significance or represent analysis? Phrasing such as suggest, appears to be correlated with, is also correlated with. All of these are phrases that suggest either some kind of claim or some kind of identification of significance. Warrant some further investigation discussed in the following subsections. This is pretty standard in this kind of a scientific document that there's a mention of implications for further research. There's also a mention that there's a little more detail coming up. And I'm going to just see what's coming up in it. So exactly, that's a good point that you're mentioning hedging language. And again, Jing Yi, you say the last paragraph is a claim but sounds weak. So none of us knows this area well enough to understand why, but I would say that I would venture to say, and this is just from a very layperson perspective, that in this area there's a tradition of really focusing on laying out huge amounts of data. And I think, excuse me, Tara, you might come closest to relating to this, laying out huge amounts of data as illustrations. And then, and making sure to talk about how it connects with research that's already been done to a degree, and then adding a small contribution, in terms of your discussion, a small statement about a new insight or a new finding or something that can be contributed to the discussion, and doing all of this in a way to try to maintain as close to a tone of objectivity as possible. So for those of us who are used to wrestling with theories and ideas and looking at underlying assumptions, this approach can appear very superficial, right? And very, I'm not going to commit to anything kind of thing. On the other hand, if we flip it from this approach, taking this sort of more hardcore, we have to present all of the quantitative stuff and let it kind of speak for itself as well. Poking around at underlying assumptions can seem to be undermining that process. So I'm going to just see to, yes, so Tala, and if you would like to unmute and add to this, please do, because you're coming from much more of an area of expertise with this than I am. But what Tala says is absolutely, in the medical or hard sciences, this is very common. We suggest, demonstrate, display, and support. We never say prove. Well stated. And then Nick, along those lines, it's actually interesting that there aren't more citations or references to other work in this section. And I think this goes back to Tala's point about we're suggesting, we're demonstrating, we're displaying the sort of mathematical models, and we're going to go into these mathematical models or results in more detail in the upcoming subsections.
Exactly. It's like we would expect them to sort of like spend the next couple of paragraphs saying, if we think that that's the story, then let's see if we find any other evidence out there too to support it or whatever. That would be my expectation. Of course, this is not my field, so it'd be interesting to see.
Or yeah, that's one. And another one might simply be to say, okay, now we're going to look at each one of these parameters and interactions in yet more depth, but keep looking at these illustrations of various mathematical relationships. Yeah, thanks. And Tala, is there anything you want to add to that?
No, I think y'all covered it. Yeah, we actually have some postulates in the hard sciences that pretty much say if you say the word prove, then you're not a hard scientist and you should be out, kind of thing.
And there's no wrong or right. It just depends on what the approach is. If someone were taking a specific theoretical approach to analyzing why this is done, that might be different. But if you're doing this kind of analysis, you want to make sure you stay away from anything that doesn't sound like hedging in a way, but always illustrating every point you're making with charts and graphs and other kinds of visual models. Okay, good, thank you. Now here's sample passage 2, and I think you'll find this looks a little different. So again, just as a reminder, No problem, Kamila. Thank you so much. And do feel free to reach out if other questions come up. So again, we've got identify the claim, what data is used to support the claim. Does any phrasing refer to the data's significance? And this kind of phrasing represents forms of analysis. And does the paragraph work? What are its strengths and weaknesses? So thanks, Nick, for popping that in. So here we go. From cultural expectations and concerns emerged two predominant themes: cultural expectations for the school and cultural expectations for school leadership. In each interview, there was a statement where cultural expectations for the school or school leadership was emphasized. The data support a call for school leaders to acknowledge that refugee parents tend to value their child's happiness and safety, and their respect for school leaders increases when they feel their child's happiness and safety are being met. Cultural expectations of school leadership fell into the predominant form of communication, with all 5 interviewees mentioning school to home communication as important. From this research, it is important for school leaders to develop the relational side of their role with the school community, specifically the refugee community. In that passage, where would you say the claim was? Want to take a look at it? I can see 3 possibilities depending on the purpose of this paragraph. We could just go with this first statement: from cultural expectations and concerns emerge 2 predominant themes: cultural expectations for the school and cultural expectations for school leadership. On the other hand, thinking back to the previous passage, we could also think about, well, is that just kind of describing or summarizing? Another possibility is the data support a call for school leaders to acknowledge that refugee parents tend to value their child's happiness and safety, and the respect for school leaders increases when they feel their child's happiness and safety are being met. Okay, there's another possibility, but is that a little too specific? And then we come to, from this research, it is important for school leaders to develop the relational side of their role with the school community, specifically the refugee community. So that's another possibility. I mean, there are all sorts of possibilities. Yeah, okay, Lynn, you are mentioning the data support. So talk to us about that. Are you thinking that that might be where the claim is, or are you thinking that that might be sort of where analysis is happening to broaden the discussion of the claim? Yeah, there's no right or wrong here.
I don't know. I think in the beginning, in each interview, they were actually pointing back to the findings, to actually like something that was legitimately maybe in the findings section, that there were statements maybe that were disclosed in the findings section, and that subsequent section, the data support, they're actually looking at that statement and taking some sort of inference or for something from a finding. I mean, that's what it seems like. I mean, I guess it would be hard to say contextually without seeing the finding. I think if we saw the finding section and then we saw the subsequent paragraph, like the paragraph after, if maybe that last sentence in the paragraph is sort of setting up the rest of the section, maybe that last, you know what I mean? It's hard to say what they're going to focus on, but it just seemed like the data support where they were actually maybe taking something that they're referencing from the findings, and they're making sort of a deeper,
Yeah.
I don't know. That's what I.
No, I like that. I like what you're saying, and I think that definitely could be that. It could be that here is for the purposes of this paragraph, they're saying here are some findings that we had, and like you said, here's what we're drawing from them. So our claim here is that the data support this need to connect, for school leaders to connect with their community, the refugee parents, the refugee community, before they even get to the point where they say it like that. So I guess I could see it backwards, like it sort of, the claim might be here, we're leading up to the claim. This inference is being pulled beautifully from the previous findings. And then I think also, like you mentioned, Lynn, that we could use this as a claim in terms of a jumping off point for further discussion. So it kind of depends on the purpose of the paragraph too. And like I said, there's no right or wrong answer. I just want to make sure let's go ahead and go to, I don't want to jump too fast, but I want to jump here to an individual activity where you kind of are asking these same questions, but using a paragraph from your own writing. And Nick, I'm gonna defer to you. This is your slide. We were gonna have you talk about this, so I want to.
Absolutely, yeah. So I think there are a couple of reasons to want to do this, but basically kind of using the same model that we were using to look at some of those other excerpts. It might be useful to go ahead and just pivot over to whatever you're working on for just a second. So, whatever Word document that you're working, if you've got an article going, or just to kind of think about this generally, or maybe something we've worked on in the past. But again, I think what we're trying to do here is strike this kind of outsider or meta kind of position where we're able to kind of look down on the writing that we're engaged in, to be able to kind of understand more about how we can see these nice distinctions between things like summarizing and analysis. So if we find one of the pieces of writing that you're working on, find a paragraph, a specific paragraph, go ahead and identify that claim that you're making in the paragraph or the series of claims. And then of course, go ahead and let's just kind of identify too some of the data that you're using to support it. And what we're really looking for here is, are we shifting into this analytical mode where we're describing the data's significance? And one of the questions that I have is, are there moments here where we're actually moving back and forth between work that's happening in the paragraph? So that last question, I think I would like to hear from y'all on. Do you find that you're doing one kind of work in these paragraphs, or are you actually switching between analysis and summary and stuff like that? So let's take a minute to do that. One quick identifying question is, what kind of work are you working on? What are you looking at? Are you looking at articles or dissertations? And please just unmute and say that, whatever you happen to be looking at. Did anybody find any, have any kind of insights about, you know, the kinds of work that they were doing in any of the paragraphs that they were taking a look at?
Another way you might want to break it down is see if you can find a paragraph, any paragraph in the draft you're working on. Doesn't have to be a dissertation, it could be a paper or whatever. See if you can separate the summary part from the analysis part and not worry about whether there's, you know, you're identifying data, claim, all of that. Is there, like Nick, I think he said, is the paragraph doing both summary and analysis, or is it just summarizing, just illustrating, or is it maybe just analyzing, just kind of drawing inferences?
Yeah, and it looks like in Lynn's case there, we're moving back and forth between these modes. And that certainly resonates with, again, kind of the work that I do for sure, where you literally do some kind of summary as a way of setting up analysis often, you know. Yeah. And it's not necessarily a problem, right? I mean, I think these things can work, they can work, they're very complementary, or can definitely be complementary. I do feel like in those IMRAD formats, there's a kind of like, what would you say, a more rigid structure for needing to separate some of that in the way that the video described, where, you know, in your results, you really want it to just be reporting results. And then in the discussion, you're able to move back and forth. But of course, even in the discussion, you're actually you're using summary to summarize findings. And then hopefully, you're piecing apart, you're blowing apart and sort of categorizing those things that you just summarized. So that way you can kind of make sense of it. And of course, what we're looking for ultimately is to make some kind of meaning, or in the way that the video referred to it. We're trying to help the reader prioritize what of the findings is the most salient or significant, or the thing that they should really walk away with.
So I didn't realize there was an acronym for that, IMRAD. That's exactly what my structure's been, and maybe that's just part of science, and then also how my advisor kind of writes papers. So I'm about to kind of enter the analysis section of a paper I'm working on. And I think without that kind of little trail, like the video mentioned, even like my scientific question a lot of the time is the title, which I also don't want to title another paper the same thing. So without that structure, I do feel a little lost sometimes. And yeah, I've had that problem like with my first paper when I was an undergraduate, like parsing out that discussion, which really encapsulates the findings and or results in analysis. That was hard for me at first. So I do like that the IMRAD's there, but maybe that's just good for the science. But yeah, I guess without that, like I said, I'm like, well, what do I even do for this title if it's not my scientific question? Which is kind of frustrating. But I'm going to rewatch that video, and I'm sure it seemed like that interview was longer too. That seemed really helpful, just to kind of listen to someone talk through that process.
It is, Allie. It's definitely it's an excerpt from a longer interview. It's great. They do a great job.
Yeah, I love that. And one of the things that comes out of that video, and then some of these other considerations, is, you know, in the results section, it's clear that what we're trying to do is like stay fairly close to the sort of first level of remove from whatever the experiment is. In other words, or whatever the sort of phenomenon is. So we're sort of saying like, these are the observable things. And maybe in your field, you have models that are part of those observable things that help to describe what's happening there. But then in the analysis or the sort of discussion, there's sort of like a second level remove, which sometimes means reintegrating it back into what's known in the other scholarship. And the other part of that is running sort of second level, you know, statistical or other kinds of analyses to be able to like get a little bit below, a little bit deeper dive and start again clustering or piecing that stuff out, I think is really key. And that structure does help. I mean, that IMRAD structure does help, although both of them mentioned in that video, you know, some of this is a convention or a conventional knowledge, which is you read a bunch of these articles and slowly understand what it is that your field considers to be, you know, this sort of second level analysis or whatever, or first level kind of observations. That's fascinating.
Yeah, I really like that first and second level because, yeah, I study these asteroids and we're trying to figure out how, you know, the earliest part of the solar system, which is a huge feat, but that's that second level. You know, I look at these asteroids, I observe them, I use this telescope, but then why, how do I piece that back in? And that's where I struggle, but I guess that's why science is kind of hard. Why does my field care? And I feel like I can do the rabbit hole reading a paper and then they reference this paper and then it's like, oh my God, I got to read about that model and then I got to do this. And then my advisor's like, whoa. But and I guess one other thing for as I move into my analysis is my advisor has me make the figures, of course, because that is the data, and then just write the captions and then slowly back out from that, which is, I guess, kind of in that IMRAD hard line structure. But yeah, this is helpful. I'm in a different time zone, so I missed the first hour, but did you guys record? Okay, it is recording, I guess, the whole bit. So to catch your first hour, I'm sure it was useful too. Thank you.
Yeah, I love that the chart and tables kind of idea too, because, you know, as writing people, one thing that's really visible or that becomes really interesting or important about the charts and tables is that obviously, like, all these pieces are collectively communicating, you know, the sort of story as well as the reporting on what's going on and everything. And you know, one thing that is another one of those finer skills that you develop sort of over time, I think, is that, my understanding at least, is that, you know, you want the actual text to complement the tables and not necessarily just restate the same thing that somebody can go to the tables for, which is another one of those moments where you can see that there is some prioritization potentially happening that is an analytical move potentially. So there's a certain level of just reporting on what the results or the, you know, the specific tabled results were. And then there's a moment at which you have to like take that table and kind of move to that other level that says like, here are the significant things in the prioritization. So I think that's a great additional point about the multimodality there. Cool. Let's see. Yeah, I love the conversation too in the chat about the separation, the sort of how obvious does it need to be. And I would definitely echo Leslie's point here. I think like these two things can definitely move into or move in a complementary kind of way. One thing that I heard a long time ago that resonated well with me was this generalized structure, particularly in humanities work, where it's like you make some kind of grand claim and then you use specific examples or specific textual evidence to be able to support the grand claim and actually bring it home and say, I'm not just making this grand claim out of nothing. It's something that I'm actually sort of digging in. And that to me is the move between some larger kinds of summary. This is what the field looks like. Modernism looks like this. And then in terms of analysis, the support that you offer actually has to be very kind of granular most of the time to say, here's the way that I'm categorizing these artifacts out there, these cultural artifacts. And if you look at the way that I'm categorizing, then you can see their relationships. And because of that, you know that I'm right about my big claim. So thank you for coming to my TED Talk, you know.
Well, and I think all of this, including the question you were asking, to me is it kind of addressed here, like, and I think when both of you talked about sort of this weaving back and forth between summary and analysis, I think that's very common. It's not really a problem or a weakness in either the humanities or things, social sciences, even cultural studies kinds of things, literature. Now, I said social sciences because that can take some kind of sometimes a really hard science approach but sometimes pull in this sort of weaving. But my point is that some fields require more of this weaving back and forth between summary and analysis. And Lynn and Jimmy, you're both describing projects that would probably require the kind of pattern that you've already noticed. Whereas, for instance, Tala, you would probably see, and Ali too, I'm not sure, but you would probably see more emphasis on summary. And again, roughing back on what Nick said, not superficial or simplistic summary, very complex summary, very complex illustrations of what's being discovered, what results you're getting, but letting that sort of those illustrations almost present the case for you. You know, saying I'm presenting my case through hard, solid data. Working with a lot of subjects and coming up with a ton of evidence. So Jimmy, I'm not sure. I want to make sure you feel like your question was at least somewhat answered. If not, let us know. Maybe we can talk about it a little bit more later.
I do. I just also want to echo what Nick was saying about the almost like a template for humanities or sometimes even social sciences writing, how you're supposed to make a claim, analyze, and then circle back to that claim in a way. And I was asking that question because I've seen some scholars doing a really awkward job circling back, and it's so you can just anticipate what their chapters are going to be like, and it gets quite boring. So I don't imagine people read everything in that kind of books, and I don't want to write something like that. So.
I don't blame you. I don't want you to either. I saw a lot of this again when I saw people, especially when I saw philosophers. There was one kind of a philosopher cultural theorist named Hayden White. And he wrote back in the 70s, 80s, 60s, 70s, 80s. What was his book? History is Narrative, I think it was called. And that title fascinated me. But it was for me, not for everyone, but for me, it ended up being very unenjoyable and difficult to read because I found him doing that sort of highly structured philosophical approach of you ask the question and answer it in one way, then you ask the same question and answer it in another way. Then you ask the question again and answer it in yet another way, and you keep doing that. So for me, the experience was in the first pages of the introduction, I figured, got a sense of the main point he was making and why. And then it felt to me like the rest of the book was just reiterating. For others, it wasn't like that. They found like they really enjoyed diving into those nitty gritty, different ways of approaching the same question. But I still remember that. Anyway, we are past the end of it, but we wanted also, we'll get you a copy of the PowerPoint and PDF version, but here's a link to that one video. And then here are some other sources that might be helpful to you, as well as links to some follow-up support just on campus. That's free to all of you. Thank you both very much. And again, reach out to us if you have any questions. Turning it over to you, David.